morning, everyone. Paul Ruppel here with Fox 29 News Now. Hope you're having a great day. We are following some breaking news here. President Trump has just urged Attorney General Sessions to end the Russia probe. The president called on the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and to end Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation before it continues to stain our country any further. Let me read for you the entire tweet that the president put out. He initially quoted law professor Alan Dershowitz, in the Legal Mind, and about some things he had to say. And then he followed that up by saying, "This is a terrible situation, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt now before it becomes a stain to stain our country any further. Bob Mueller is totally conflicted, and his 17 angry Democrats that are doing his dirty work are a disgrace to USA." He went on to add, this is going to go for a little bit. He's got a couple new tweets here. Paul Manafort, of course, who was his former campaign manager, worked for Ronald Reagan, Bob Dole, and many other highly prominent and respected political leaders. The president added, "He worked for me for a very short time. Why didn't government tell me that he was under investigation? These old charges have nothing to do with collusion, a hoax." Of course, Paul Manafort's trial got underway in the Southern District in New York yesterday. They selected a jury, heard opening arguments, and I believe had the first witness. One more statement here from the president. Russian collusion with the Trump campaign, one of the most successful in history, is a total hoax. The Democrats paid for the phony and discredited dossier, which was, along with Comey, McCabe, Strzok, and his lover, the lovely Lisa Page, used to begin the witch hunt. Disgraceful. That last one was just sent at a minute past 10 o'clock. So the president obviously making a lot of statements about the investigation there. I want to get you to a report earlier this morning that Fox's Doug Luzader had about the president being out on the campaign trail in Florida last night.
On the campaign trail.
So he had an appearance last night for a Florida gubernatorial candidate. And that appearance kind of took a life of its own. And we know that he likes to talk without a teleprompter, and he likes to say what's on his mind. And he certainly did that at this appearance last night.
Once again, touting his performance. Once again, touting his relationship with Kim Jong-un. Certainly more coming out of this one, Doug Luzader.
Good morning. Look, this was quintessential Trump last night at this rally in Florida. He kind of laid some of the groundwork for the upcoming midterm elections and also highlighted some real battles that are about to take place here in Washington.
And I will leave now because I am boring you to death. Thank you.
And President Trump told this enthusiastic crowd in Florida that being presidential is easy.
It's a lot easier to act presidential than to do what I do.
And what he does best is whip up a crowd of enthusiastic supporters, returning to the issue that arguably got him here, immigration and building a border wall. And he has talked about a government shutdown this fall unless it happens.
We may have to do some pretty drastic things, but we're going to get it.
And Democrats say his strategy on immigration hasn't worked.
Standing in the way, of course, right now is the president who says, "I want it my way." And when he put it on the floor last time, he got 39 votes, with a large number of Republicans not voting for his proposal.
But beyond all of that, there are the midterm elections. And while a shutdown could hurt Republican congressional candidates, that may not be the central issue for the president, who may have a longer-term goal in mind.
I think he can sleep soundly knowing that even if Democrats take the House as projected, it's not going to hurt him for 2020.
The argument is that he could use kind of a democratically controlled House as something of a foil and kind of run against Democrats that way in 2020. Meantime, the White House did get a little dose of stability yesterday, announcing that Chief of Staff John Kelly has been invited to stick around all the way through 2020, and he's apparently agreed to do so. That's a big deal because chiefs of staff generally don't last very long in any administration, and there were rumors aplenty that he was on his way out. So kind of a surprising announcement yesterday. Thomas and Alex.
I like that, a dose.
Again, that was Doug Luzader reporting from Washington, D.C. about the president's travels to Florida on the campaign trail last night for, I believe, the gubernatorial candidate there. I want to get you to a local story. Dunkin' Donuts this is a trouble at a drive-thru in Montgomery County. A teen employee has been arrested after police say he stole customers' credit and debit card numbers. Now police have a warning for residents this morning. Our Jennifer Joyce was reported this morning from outside the Dunkin' Donuts in Flourtown, where it all went down.
Good morning, guys. Well, it is pretty shocking. It's a 16-year-old. We are talking about a teenage girl who conducted a pretty sophisticated theft operation here at this Dunkin' Donuts in Flourtown. The teen and now former employee of the store on Bethlehem Pike was arrested on Monday. Investigators say that she had a system while working the drive-thru to steal people's credit card information. She'd snap a photo of customers' cards and then upload the information onto fake cards. She even shared them with her friends, according to police. The cards were used at Sky Zone Trampoline Park, fast food restaurants, and Lyft rides. We talked to some people who say they try to be careful and protect their information as best they can. We also talked to customers who say they love this particular store. They believe it was an isolated incident, and the store manager agrees with that statement.
This family is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. And you come in and you're greeted with respect, you're treated with kindness, and that's why I come here all the time. It's not out of the way, but I pass 3 other Dunkin' Donuts to come here, and I'd rather be here.
It was her first job, and she's only 16 years old, so I wouldn't expect from someone like that.
And that manager says she was especially surprised because many of the employees at this store have worked here for years. That 16-year-old charged with theft has only worked here a matter of weeks. The teen told police that there could be as many as 20 victims. Now, Springfield Township Police, they are urging people to check those statements and give them a call if you think that you may have been compromised. Apparently, the theft happened in June and July. Back to you.
That was Jennifer Joyce reporting from Montgomery County. A mama duck is quacking like crazy because her ducklings need help. They're stuck in a storm drain. A member of the South Jersey Fire Department that came to her rescue joined us earlier this morning on Good Day Philadelphia.
Well, down the shore, a mother duck's 4 ducklings got stuck in a storm drain in Ventnor. So we're going to show you some video because it is very cute, because it's a happy ending to the story. But we're going to show you video from moments after the ducklings fell, and you can see the mom. She's just crying for help, or quacking.
Settle down, Ma.
Settle down, Ma. You hear that? Rescuers, along with some Good Samaritans, they lifted the 300-pound iron grate, and then they used a net to scoop out the little ducklings. But the best part is when the family reunites.
So once again, the family of ducks, they have been released safely back into the bay. Dan Carew, one of the firefighters that set them free, joining us this morning. Was that you in the video saying, "Settle down, Mom"?
Yeah, it was.
It was you.
I didn't know it was being recorded at that point.
You didn't? But thank goodness you did, because so many people, they are loving this video. They think it's so cute.
Yeah, it's a great story with a happy ending. So I mean, what's not to enjoy about it?
So what kind of call did you get? Like, was it literally, hey, there's some ducks, can you come help save them?
Yeah, we have an electronic dispatch system, and it comes over the air, and it said, you know, we're ducks in the sewer, and we have that a lot because we're a shore town, and we went there and did what we had to do.
How many duck rescues have you been on?
Me personally, probably around 3 or 4.
3 or 4.
Oh, see, I told you in commercial break, I'm going to have to call you the Duck Whisperer because you're over here saving duck families and everything else.
I'll take it. I've been called worse, so I'll take it.
So you arrived on scene. People were gathering around the storm drain. Take us through what happened next.
We pulled up, and we saw a lot of people crowded around, and we knew it was a duck rescue. So in my head, I'm thinking the tools we need. So we grabbed it's called a Halligan bar. It's basically a firefighter's pry bar. And my partner Fred was there, and he grabbed the net, and we started to go to work on getting the grate up. And it was really heavy, and sometimes it can be rusted and hard to get up. So we just did the best we could to try to keep people back. So the ducks weren't scared.
And what about the mama duck? Was she quacking the whole time you guys were doing this?
She was standing guard, trying to keep people away.
How cute. And so then you pried it up, and how were the ducklings when you first looked down and saw them?
They were fine.
Okay.
But they got a little bit scared, and they kind of took off. They ran from where we could see them down the drain pipe a little bit. So we had to kind of pull back a little bit and just let them get a little more comfortable so they'd come back so Fred could grab them with the net.
As you just swooped in, and one by one, how many ducklings were there?
There were 4.
4 of them.
And so once we saw the little reunion, which was really cute, did they just walk along their very little way, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they walked away, and then Fred kind of just watched them along, walk away to make sure they were out of the way and safe.
Because there were some people were saying they got stuck in another drain, but that didn't happen, did it?
They didn't call us, so I assume not.
And you're apparently the people to call, because how many calls do you guys get when it comes to animal rescues?
I'd say usually? We get a year, like 15 to 20 for various animal rescues.
What's the strangest?
The strangest animal rescue?
Yeah.
Or
well,
yeah.
now I'm curious.
Yeah, what kind of stuff are you talking about here?
We're a small town, but we get everything that the firefighters here in Philly get. We just get it, I guess, a little less frequently.
Is it typical up in the tree? People always have firefighters.
I've gotten a cat out of a tree, yeah. People laugh, but it actually happens.
It does happen. Okay. Well, thank you for what you do. And please tell everyone back in Ventnor that we said thank you as well.
Oh, will do. Thank you very much for having me.
On the duck hunt. All right.
Of course. Dan the Duck Whisperer. We appreciate it. 8:09.
Hello again, everybody. Paul Ruppel here with Fox 29 News Now. I want to get you to a business story right now. Facebook under the radar for possible election meddling. Under the radar over possible election meddling. And a popular airline is bagging peanuts. Fox Business Network's Tracy Carrasco has more in today's Business Outlook.
Good morning. Optimism that the U.S. and China were making progress on trade helped lift the Dow 108 points yesterday. And Apple firing on all cylinders, beating analyst earnings estimates. The stock soaring 4% after the news as Apple approaches the $1 trillion market cap mark. Facebook says it's identified a new coordinated political campaign meant to mislead users and stir up anger on hot-button issues ahead of the November midterm elections. It has removed 32 pages and accounts from Facebook and Instagram as part of an ongoing effort to fight foreign meddling in U.S. elections. Facebook didn't say who is behind the misinformation. As of today, Southwest Airlines will no longer give its passengers peanuts. It'll be pretzels from here on out and maybe some other snacks on longer flights. Southwest announced the change last month out of concern for passengers with peanut allergies. And Yelp is adding the Open to All feature meant to protect consumers from discrimination. The app allows businesses to be marked as, quote, open to all regardless of race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. That's business. For more, log on to foxbusiness.com. In New York, I'm Tracy Carrasco.
I want to get you some information about a couple stories we're following this morning. One is the man accused in a deadly stabbing near Rittenhouse Square is due in court this morning. Let's show you a little video about that. The district attorney is expected to argue for a lesser charge. Michael White is in jail for first-degree murder, but could be released soon if the charge is reduced to manslaughter. Our Lauren Johnson has been reporting on the story this morning. She's there in court. Police say the 20-year-old plunged a knife into the back of a real estate developer, Sean Skellinger, during a fight on 17th Street last month. White's family argues that he acted in self-defense. Last night, dozens of people gathered for a special prayer service to pay tribute to both men and their families. White's family also says that the 20-year-old has never been convicted of any crimes and turned himself into police. We're also waiting for an event to get started in Washington, D.C. that we're going to take you to live once that happens. Let's get you a live look at Capitol Hill. The Senate Intelligence Committee is holding a hearing on foreign influence on social media platforms, perspectives from third-party social media experts. That's the name of the hearing. It's going to focus on testimony is expected from new Knowledge Director of Research Renee DeRista, Graphica founder and CEO John Kelly, not to be confused with the Chief of Staff, Rand Corporation Senior Behavioral Scientist Dr. Todd Helmus, Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Director Laura Rosenberger, and Oxford Internet Institute Director Dr. Philip Howard. Again, this was slated to begin at 9:30 this morning, so I'm trying to get some more information about when this is going to get started. And once we have that, we will take you there live. Hello again. Let's get you a look at your weather. Sue Sario has been talking about the severe outlook today and tonight. There is a chance of some storms. We are expecting some possibility of storms. You see Philadelphia is in the marginal area, whereas parts of the region to the north and west are in the slight threat location for that. Let's get you a live look at radar so you can see what's happening right now. You see some rain up to the north a little bit in the western suburbs of Philadelphia, drifting away a bit. Let's get you a close-up look of radar here. This is a little bit closer, and it's going into motion now. So as Sue Sario, Weather Authority, told you this morning, it's not a good hair day. It is pretty humid out there. Here's a look at the conditions this morning and what we expect, your day planner. For the morning drive, it was about 75 with clouds and showers. You might have had some heavy rain move through at times overnight and into the morning. Around lunchtime, there is a storm chance, a high of 82 degrees. Or a temperature of 82 degrees, and then we're supposed to get up to about 87 with storms and warmer for the PM drive. Here's a look at the conditions by location there. You see several areas. Pardon me. Several areas are going to be in the mid to upper 80s, some storms in the area. Might see some sunshine down the shore, but generally some cloudy conditions across the area. It's going to get hot and humid. Warm and humid, showers, thunderstorm, high of 87 as we mentioned. Winds out of the south at 10 to 15 miles per hour, and your sunset's creeping up to 8:14 p.m. now. Here's a look at the 7-day forecast. It's humid and stormy theme for Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Highs in the upper to mid 80s. AM shower, but then some afternoon sun on Saturday. You see the Phillies are back in town for a 4-game stand. Saturday's high is 85. Then we're heating up. Sunday we're back in the 90s. I see a lightning bolt there, so probably a chance of storms. And you see those 3 90s in a row, that would make a heat wave. We could get to a heat wave by Tuesday. We're waiting to hear more about that. Here is a live look at outside our studios in Old City, Philadelphia. Let's get you the current conditions. It's 79 right now, dew point of 73, so you can see the humidity right there. Winds out of the south at 10 miles per hour. And you can see the cloud cover over there. A little bit of sun peeking through the clouds, but not much. Let's take you on a trip around the region with our regional weather cameras. I'm going to play them out for you right now. right, Paul Ruppel here again with you. We are going to take you right now live to an event. Let me see where this is. It appears to be maybe a look at the California wildfires. Let's take that to you live. Waiting for some information about where this is occurring, but this appears to be a look at the wildfires in California. All right, while we wait for some information on where that's occurring and what's going on, let's get you a story here, local story. Here's some video of betting in casinos in New Jersey. The Atlantic City Casino will become the fourth in New Jersey to offer sports betting in about a half an hour. Harrah's Casino plans to start taking sports bets at 11 a.m. today, 2 days after its sister property, Bally's, did. So far, the Borgata, Ocean Resort, and Bally's are offering sports bets, along with 2 horse racing tracks, the Meadowlands and Monmouth Park. This is all according to the Associated Press. What everyone's waiting for is approval to offer mobile or online sports betting. No one has yet been approved to offer that, although numerous gambling companies have applied to state gambling regulators for permission to do so before the football season begins in September. The Borgata, which was the first casino to offer sports betting on June 14th, is presumably furthest along in the approval process for online sports betting. And Kevin Ortzman, Atlantic City president for Caesars Entertainment, said he hopes his company, which includes Bally's and Harrah's, could be approved for mobile sports betting by the end of August if regulatory and technological hurdles are overcome. New Jersey won a U.S. Supreme Court case in May, clearing the way for all 50 states to offer sports betting should they choose to do so. All right, we have some information now about the fire we were looking at here. This is a fire burning near State Route 14 near the town of Wishram, Washington. It's grown to an estimated 11,000 acres, and some residents are now under a level 3 evacuation order, meaning go now. This shot is from courtesy of one of our sister stations in the Washington area. Again, this is a fire burning near State Route 14 near the town of Wishram, Washington. It's now at about 11,000 acres, and some residents are under a level 3 evacuation order. We're going to take a live look at this for a little bit, and we'll get you more information as it comes in.
Yes, Senator, I believe that's exactly correct. I think they have long-term strategic goals, which include weakening Western institutions and faith in democracy and traditional sources of information and authority. That's the strategic goal. And then they have a lot of near short-term tactical goals, things like injecting hacked information to sway a particular event or election. And they're doing that activity all around their periphery and now here.
Ms. DeResta, this is a question for both you and Dr. Kelly. Both of you emphasized that Russian manipulation did not stop in 2016. In fact, you, Dr. Kelly, said that Russia stepped on the gas and increased its activity. And Ms. DeResta, you said that Russian efforts increased post-election to promote racial tensions in our country. We impose sanctions on Russia. They seem to have done no good when it comes to this kind of activity. What can we do beyond educating the public to counter Russia more effectively? Ms. DeResta, I'll start with you.
I would say that one of the things that we need to do is to evaluate our information operations doctrine. JP 313, I believe Senator Warner alluded to this in his recent policy proposals. I think that addressing the scale and sophistication of information operations is something that, as a government, we've not really looked at that in quite some time, and perhaps that would be a good place for us to start.
Thank you. Dr. Kelly.
I think there's a technical component, which is to be able to effectively detect and attribute this activity so you can authoritatively prove it's happening. And then you have a more traditional toolkit of foreign policy measures to take action.
Dr. Howard, I want to get to something you said, and that was you gave us several compelling examples from your Hungarian experience where they received clearly false stories that were intended to explain the downing of the Malaysian airline. And what's interesting to me is, based on Dr. Kelly's testimony, it isn't just the Hungarian press that is being manipulated or infiltrated or controlled, but we've seen evidence where America's media is also being targeted. And Dr. Kelly pointed out that the Russian persona of Jenna Abrams, who had accounts on multiple platforms, was cited by more than 40 U.S. journalists before being unmasked. How can the media be more sensitive or more aware, more on guard to being manipulated in this way?
Thank you, Senator. The United States actually has the most professionalized media in the world. It's learned, certainly, to evaluate their sources, no longer report tweets as given. So I would say that in this country, the most professional news outlets are already on the defense. They're already have ways to ensure that the quality of their news product isn't shaped by these kinds of disinformation campaigns. I would say that the greater concern would be amongst the media institutions in our democratic allies. I believe that the Russians have moved from targeting us in particular to Brazil and India, other enormous democracies that will be running elections in the next few years. And while we still see significant Russian activity, those countries have the media institutions that need to learn, need to develop.
Ms. Rosenberger.
Thank you, Senator. I would just add that this is not a problem that we've overcome. We have one example, for instance, of an IRA-created Twitter account. The handle was Woke Louisa, that was tweeting in particular aimed at African Americans, focused on the NFL Take a Knee debate. There were IRA-created accounts tweeting on both sides of that debate. But that Twitter account in particular, which was active through earlier this year, appeared in more than 24 news stories from outlets such as BBC, USA Today, Time, Wired, The Huffington Post, and BET. So this was about 4 months ago. So we really do need to make sure that this information is not getting laundered into the broader ecosystem, which is part of the strategy here.
And the issue there is when we read it in a credible source, we're likely to believe
That's exactly right. It gives it that much more credibility.
Thank you.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you. It seems to me for now and the foreseeable future, protecting America's private data is going to be a national security issue. Cambridge Analytica, like the Russians, exploited Facebook's lax protections to abuse Americans' information. I believe a significant part of the failure is the fact that the Federal Trade Commission doesn't have the authority or the resources to be a tougher cop on the beat. And I'm going to be rolling out a plan to fix that in the weeks ahead. Now, let me go to questions. Ms. DiResta, your testimony referenced the Russian Facebook pages in 2016 targeting both the right and the left. But you noted it was the pages targeting the left that included not only content intended to appeal to its audience, but also content intended to suppress the vote and be critical of Secretary Clinton. In your view, does the apparent Russian content released yesterday by Facebook resemble the content the Russians used last time to attract an audience on the left and among racial minorities, which the Russians then used to suppress their vote?
Yes, sir, it does. There's a strong component of cultural posts that appear in communities and pages targeting minority voters. A lot of pride-related content, less news, more memes, and that reflects what we saw yesterday.
Well, I appreciate that, because content targeting, I think, is clearly going to be a big part of the challenge. The public's got to be aware of it, because not all Russian propaganda is going to get caught, and Americans are inevitably going to read some of it, particularly if it's consistent with what they already believe. So I gather what you're saying, Ms. DiResta, is the public has got to be alert to a repeat of the 2016 Russian playbook, which was to attract an audience on the left, discourage them from voting, and that could mean attacking Democratic candidates, pushing the line, in effect, so that the Russians are trying to make it possible that our votes don't matter. Is that essentially your concern?
Yes, sir. There's a lot of efforts to push intra-party divisions on the left.
Good. Let me ask you now, if I could, maybe for you, Ms. DiResta, Ms. Rosenberg, Dr. Kelly, about this concept known as downranking. And my interest here is that for the social media companies, there's just a mismatch of incentives. The social media companies, they want users and clicks and impressions, and inflammatory and often false content creates that. So even when the companies can't or haven't decided to identify a certain account as either foreign or nefarious, they can still downgrade the posts to limit their exposure. This is an equal or worse problem with conspiracies and junk news as it is with foreign influence. My question here would be for the three of you, do you think these downranking programs are effective? Are they the kind of thing that ought to be considered part of the kind of toolbox as we look to deal with this problem, Ms. DiResta and the rest of you?
Sure. So I think that there's sort of three facets to the toolbox. There's remove, reduce, or inform. Inform means to add additional context to a post. This is Facebook's framework right now. Reduce would be to do something like downrank it. Per the question earlier about is it possible to inject just a little bit of friction, this is where downranking could potentially be used as a tool as attribution and authenticity and integrity are established to reduce the reach of content. And then remove is, of course, the most extreme.
Would any of you like to add anything? Yes.
I'd just like to note that we talk about downranking, but we forget that upranking is also part of the process. These platforms are not...
You're being way too logical.
These platforms are not neutral pipes.
Right.
Information is not being served up without some kind of algorithm deciding, for most of the platforms, without an algorithm basically deciding what is served up at the top. So when we talk about downranking, we have to start from the premise that upranking is baked into the cake. And so then the question becomes, are these platforms actually somehow prioritizing bad, malicious information, right? That, as we know and as others mentioned in their testimony, gaming these algorithms, whether that's on trying to get certain content to trend or, frankly, getting certain content to rise to the top of Google searches, something that we know that Sputnik and our team...
I'm over my time. I just want to be clear. As the author of Section 230, the days when these pipes are considered neutral are over, because the whole point of 230 was to have a shield and a sword, and the sword hadn't been used, and these pipes are not neutral. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much of the activity we're looking at on the charts and today is largely the IRA. What percentage of Russian-linked activity would you anticipate that the IRA represents? Is this half of everything they try to do, 90%, 10%? Who would have a sense of what we're not looking at when we're looking at the IRA activity?
We've looked at a number of different known disinformation campaigns, and we think the IRA folks are involved in a minority of them.
In a minority of them, you think that would be the case here as well?
I do. The thing we don't know, though, is how much of the IRA this is.
Ms. Rosenberger, do you want to comment on that?
I would just only add that we know from Special Counsel Mueller's indictment, actually, of the GRU, there is one section of that that notes that GRU operatives utilize social media accounts and fake websites that they created in order to spread hacked information and other kinds of weaponized information. So we certainly know that there are other actors. GRU is probably better at hiding their tracks than the IRA is. And so I think that just speaks to, again, how this is probably just one tip of the iceberg of what we're looking at.
So the early discussion clearly has moved from what the Russians were paying for, which appears to be a very small fraction of the impact they were having. Does anybody disagree with that? That is clearly, and this IRA activity is some fraction of the Russian activity in 2016, 17, and into 18. That would be so. I think the Mueller indictment, said that there were probably at least 80 IRA employees involved and millions of dollars involved in that effort. I don't know, what is that, $5 million or $100 million? What amount of money do you think the Russians invested in this effort that was covered by the Mueller indictment? He uses the term millions of dollars. That could mean a lot of different things. Any idea of the activity you've looked at? What kind of investment of money and how many people that may have been involved in this?
We've done that audit globally. We believe that $500 million has been spent by the 40 governments that we've studied since 2010. In the Russian case, we think it's around 200 million US over this extended period for the full set of organizations behind the various campaigns.
And Dr. Howard, on that topic, in the other countries you've looked at, who should we be looking at after Russia that are likely impacting our daily conversation in the country in some ranked order? Who would be the top 3 or 4 countries that you would believe would be most actively out there doing what Russia is also doing?
Well, in our research, we look at Turkey, China, Hungary, and Iran.
Dr. Kelly, you have a thought on that?
We believe there's a growing black market for people skilled who have these dark arts, and they're employing them in their own countries, and they're also starting to get hired to work in other countries. So this is a critical challenge because the Russians may have been the first to effectively do this, but they're not the only players, and you'll have a black market of players who are mobile and can be hired by any actor.
Well, just to be sure I understand, Dr. Howard, the 40 countries, are these 40 countries you've looked at for outside activity or 40 countries that are participating in this kind of activity?
These are 40 countries that have organized disinformation campaigns in the sense of stable personnels with telephones and family benefits. These are formal organizations that do this work.
And how many countries do you think those 40 countries would be trying to influence activity in?
7 countries.
7 countries?
There's 7 authoritarian regimes that have dedicated budgets for disinformation campaigns targeting voters in other countries.
And how many other countries again?
Our audit of government expenditures covers 40 in total. It's usually the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, Germany that are the targets.
That are the targets. On Dr. Kelly's comment about determining attribution, we have in our country, we are focused on defense. No administration has yet figured out what our offense should be. And I think one of those reasons is we have not figured out with certainty how we would determine where a cyber attack came from, as opposed to even cyber disinformation, which is a different kind of cyber attack. But vulnerable infrastructure, what we're seeing here is a vulnerable social media infrastructure that may be every bit as critical infrastructure as any of the other infrastructure we're trying to protect. Mr. Rosenberg, I'm going to let you have the last answer to my questions.
Senator, I would just note on that Russia is playing to its asymmetric advantage. This is a low-cost, high-reward kind of tactic. We need to also evaluate what are our own asymmetric advantages, and sometimes that's not responding symmetrically or in the same domain. So, for instance, when it comes to Russia, I think this is why imposing costs in the financial space in particular, we know that Putin cares most about his power, and his power rests on his money. And I think that looking at ways that we can dry up the sources of funding, both for these activities as well as for the regimes that are using them, is incredibly important. When it comes to China, things like reputational costs are very important. So I think this is why it's important that we put this conversation on the national security front in a broader strategic frame to identify our own asymmetric advantages so we can go on offense.
Senator Heinrich.
Ms. Rosenberger, I believe it was you who said, and I may be paraphrasing here, but we've moved from a failure of imagination to a failure to act. Do you find it troubling that despite the current risk, despite the quickly approaching 2018 midterms, that concrete responses like the Secure Elections Act, like the Honest Ads Act, have not been scheduled for a vote in the United States Senate?
Yes, Senator, I do believe that while this is a complex problem, there are some clear steps that we can take, in particular on the defensive side as well as on the deterrent side, that we need to be taking urgently.
I share that concern because I think some of these things are sitting right in front of us, and we just need to make it a priority. For Ms. DiResta and Dr. Kelly, the committee's analysis shows that the Internet Research Agency's campaign focused heavily on socially divisive issues. But fanning racial division in particular was the single most targeted category of effort. Are Russian information warfare operations using unresolved racial tensions here as a weapon to weaken the United States?
Yes, I believe they are.
Absolutely.
Do you see that ongoing exploitation of racial tensions as a direct threat to our national security and, for that matter, our cohesiveness as a country?
You could think of this as a social cohesion attack to try and drive wedges into the American public, where maybe a little wedge or a piece of history in our past is being exploited to make 21st century America look more like 1950s America than it ought to.
I would agree.
So we now know much more about the Russians' 2016 campaign than we did before we started this investigation. And we know it was far broader than we originally thought. We know that it's highly active today, as many of you have testified to. And we know that no single entity by itself, not the government, the social media companies, not civil society, can effectively stop foreign influence operations on social media. But Ms. Rosenberger, in your view, have we as a nation extracted the sort of price or penalty for this behavior that would deter Vladimir Putin from acting in this way? Or has the Russian Federation simply gotten a pass so far in terms of the price that we have chosen and that this administration has chosen to extract?
So I think it's evident by the fact that this kind of activity continues that we have not yet effectively deterred it. One thing I would note is that in classic deterrence theory, deterrence relies on two prongs. One is credibility and one is capability. And I think it's incredibly important, number one, that on the credibility front, we have very clear, consistent messages from across the government, starting with our leadership and all the way down.
Including the White House.
Including the White House. That this behavior will not be tolerated and that there will be consequences for it going forward, and articulating what those consequences will be. And I think that there is a role for Congress to play here in terms of teeing up triggers that would be automatic. And I know there is consideration of such measures, and I welcome that. But I think that it also has to start, the credibility piece has to be very, very clear. Vladimir Putin cannot see from one place that there is a potential for consequences, but then over here be getting a very different mixed message. We have to have consistency. That has to be credibility coupled with the capability to act.
I could not agree more. And you mentioned financial cost as one of our asymmetric advantages. What would you foresee as a potential cost that we might extract for this kind of ongoing misbehavior?
I think there's two different ways of looking at it. One is, of course, very targeted sanctions and other kinds of designations. The other is thinking more broadly about how our financial system, the Western financial system, frankly, is used for Putin and his cronies to hide the money that they have stolen, by the way, from the Russian people. And just as we have vulnerabilities in our information domain, we have vulnerabilities in our financial system. I think steps like providing transparency around beneficial ownership, extending and legislating the geographic targeting orders that the Treasury Department has been using. There's a whole suite of steps that we outline in our report that I mentioned earlier.
I will read those in the report. I want to hit one last thing, and then my time is up. You all mentioned the broader ecosystem. Can you just confirm so that people understand this isn't just a couple of platforms? This is music apps. This is video games. This is meme sharing. It's much broader than Twitter and Google.
I would expect that they have people whose job it is to figure out how to exploit every small new platform that comes along.
Thank you all.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this what I think is a very important hearing, and thank you all for all the information that you've shared. I've been listening and came up with a couple of conclusions. Tell me if I'm right. One is there is a massive, sophisticated, persistent campaign on multiple fronts to misinform, divide, and ultimately manipulate the American people. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I wanted to hear yes because nods don't go in the record.
Yes.
Let the record show everybody.
Yes, Senator.
Yes.
I think that's incredibly important because in all of this whole Russia active measures thing, a lot of the space and energy has been going into campaigns and elections and collusion and those kinds of questions. This is an enormous part of what's going on, and it worries me that we've sort of lost sight of this. Second thing I've learned from you is, number one, it's still happening. Is that correct?
Yes.
Absolutely still happening.
Yes.
It's way beyond election.
Yes.
Secondly, it's more sophisticated than it was in 2016. They're learning to hide their tracks, not pay in rubles. That I would have thought they would have figured that out before, but more sophisticated. And then finally, it seems to me what you've been suggesting is we're asymmetrically vulnerable because of the First Amendment and democracy. We believe our whole system's based on information. And we have this principle of open access to information. Thomas Jefferson said we can tolerate error as long as truth is free to combat it. Thomas Jefferson never met Facebook, I might add. But would you agree that we are particularly vulnerable because of the nature of our society?
Yes.
Now, this one's for the record because I think it is a long answer. It seems to me there are three ways to combat this. And the first, and this is what I would hope you would supply for the record, technical solutions. Things that have been mentioned today that we could do and that Facebook could do, or Google, or Reddit, or Twitter, whoever. Technical solutions, identifying bots, for example, those kinds of things. Please give us some specificity and things that you think we might be able to do without violating the First Amendment. I shudder when I hear the words regulate the internet. I don't want to do that, but there may be things that we can do that could be helpful. The second thing, it seems to me, and Dr. Helmus, you mentioned this in your testimony, we need to do a better job of media literacy. I had a meeting just before, in the fall of 16, with a group of people from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And I said, what do you do about this problem with the Russians' propaganda? And you can't unplug the internet, you can't unplug your TV. They had a very interesting answer. They said, the way it works over here is everybody knows it's happening. And therefore, when something like this comes online, people say, oh, it's just the Russians again. We haven't gotten to that point. Dr. Helmus, is that what you mean by improved media literacy?
Yes, precisely. To be able to recognize these instances when they appear, and to be able to process those in a way that can minimize the impact.
But that goes, it's deeper than just having a hearing. This has got to be, where our kids are growing up with these devices, but not necessarily being taught how they can be manipulated by their devices. I think there ought to be standardized courses in high school called digital literacy, and increasing the public's awareness that they are being conned, or that at least they're potentially being conned, and how to ask those kinds of questions.
Senator, I think that's right. It has to include online literacy as well as just your standard media literacy, but it also can't just be in the schools. One of the things we know from research is that, in fact, it may be that older populations who are not growing up with technology may, in some cases, be more vulnerable to manipulation by this kind of activity.
I would argue that's because they grew up with newspapers and they have this unspoken assumption about editors and fact checkers.
I think that's probably right, sir.
And if you do your website in Times New Roman, people
Yes.
give it some credibility.
Especially if it's your friend sharing it, or somebody you believe to be your friend.
And your friend may be sharing something which they got from somebody that they didn't know where
Absolutely.
it came from.
Absolutely.
Final point, and I think you've touched on this, is deterrence. Ultimately, we cannot rely exclusively on defense. The problem thus far, it seems to me, is that the Russians in this case and others see us as a cheap date. We are an easy target with no results. Nothing happens. And that would be something I hope you all, again, could take for the record, because of a lack of time, to give us some thoughts about deterrence. And I think it's important. It doesn't have to be cyber. It could be deterrence in a number of areas, including sanctions, as we've discussed. But there has to be some price to be paid. Otherwise, as we now know, it's going to continue. So give me some thoughts on deterrence for the record. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for coming today to help us. This is a critical topic, which I hope all Americans are watching. We as an open voting society need to be informed. A properly informed voter population is the key to a sound democracy. Unfortunately, Russia is trying to undermine that foundation. A quick look back through American history shows that our allies and adversaries have changed over time. The Soviet Union, specifically Lenin and Stalin, openly criticized the capitalist West before World War II. During our mutual fight against Nazi Germany, President Roosevelt called Stalin Uncle Joe, and the U.S. and USSR fought a mutual enemy. After the end of the war, we found ourselves in an adversarial relationship known as the Cold War that lasted decades. We saw a brief thaw in relations during the 1990s, but now Russia, specifically Vladimir Putin, and the U.S. seem to be adversarials again. I would ask, I think, Mr. Howard, your written testimony, you described Russian computational propaganda aimed at everything that we've heard today, polarizing voters, discrediting certain political candidates, discouraging citizens to vote. So I would ask, which country, we know Russia, poses the greatest threat to our democracy using social media platforms, and which countries are making strides to do the same?
Thank you, Senator. I agree that Russia has been the most innovative in developing these kinds of techniques. Unfortunately, I think it's safe safe to say that dictators learn from each other. So as they see successful campaigns run in particular countries, they emulate. They sink their own resources into developing similar capacity. Some of these countries have retasked small military units to do entirely social media campaigning. So as I mentioned earlier, there are now seven different countries who are most would agree are
actively involved,
authoritarian regimes that are actively developing these kinds of.
And which one do you think? Which one has the greatest potential to do harm? Russia is unquestionably the absolute greatest violator.
I believe China has the next best capacity in this.
If they want to turn loose on us.
If they want to.
And you haven't seen that yet.
Not directly in the U.S. sphere.
I would ask this to any of you all: is there any country that has been successful at deterring Russia or any other attackers from other countries?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's hard to know sort of the counterfactual of what would have happened in different cases in some of these instances. There is some evidence that in the German and French elections that deterrent messaging from the top, from the leadership there about the consequences for this kind of activity may have reduced in some ways the kind of activity.
How about Macron's election in France? We saw that he fought back as soon as they saw the attacks being made by Russia. They were actively involved.
There are some interesting lessons that we may be able to learn from.
Dr. Kelly, on you. I'm so sorry.
No, please, absolutely.
Our time is very limited.
No, I answered too quickly before. I think the Macron case is a perfect example of how being aware of it, the kind of situational awareness, as well as quick and decisive action to counter it in terms of public, speech by the leadership had an effect.
Let me just ask, I got one final question. We have a little bit of time here, but I want to see your all's opinion. In West Virginia, people are having a hard time deciding where to get the facts. And fake news seems to be the real news, depending on where they get it from. Social media and sometimes on networks, if you will. Can I ask each one of you all, where do you receive your news that you believe is factual? Where do you go to? Where could I help a West Virginian find some real news and not have to rely on trying to decipher themselves? Was it fake or not? Is it made up, real or not? And I'll start, Dr. Howard, and go right down.
I go to PBS, BBC, and the Canadian Broadcasting Company.
I'm old-fashioned, and I tend to still like newspapers as my sort of major sources. Like I like having publishers involved and editors who are able to fact-check content.
I'm a New Yorker, and I'll go with the old gray lady.
New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal.
Major newspapers.
Not one of you mentioned social media. Not one of you all mentioned what we're here talking about is where you get your news or where you trust your news to come from. I think that speaks volumes of what we're dealing with today. I have no further questions after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. And I just might add to his comment about what happened in France. France also did some things that constitutionally we can't do. So let's recognize the fact that they had a very loud message and they had a very big stick that they used. And we might not get the same results, though that doesn't change for the loud voice. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. No one mentioned TMZ either. There's some good stuff on TMZ. And I'm on it as often as I can get on there. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about the terminology that we use, because I think this is one of the things that's really impeding the way forward, and get your insight on all this. The first is, now I've had people come up to me and say, well, everybody spies on everyone, but this is not really about espionage, certainly not in the traditional sense. This is not, I mean, there may be elements that involve espionage, hacking a computer, getting into a system, a network, and stealing emails and the like, but this is not really an espionage situation. The other term that's always thrown around is collusion, and there's ongoing efforts to answer all those questions. But this sort of thing doesn't really involve, or doesn't really require collusion. You don't need the cooperation of a political candidate or party to be able to do any of this. In fact, many of the ads that were pulled down yesterday have nothing to do with a candidate or a party in the short term. And it isn't even quite clear what the psychology behind it is, other than to get us to fight against each other. So if you can just if people would just put aside the whole espionage focus and put aside, the collusion focus and let that be dealt with the way it's being dealt with, we get left with the term interference, and that's become such a generic term that it almost sounds benign. Interference sounds like everything from the leadership of another country had a preference about who won the election to actually actively engaged in helping somebody get elected. And I would hope, and maybe you disagree, I hope you agree, this is more than that. This is really nothing less than informational warfare. This is just another type of warfare to weaken an adversary. And that's how Vladimir Putin views the United States of America. So, for example, if he conducted a kinetic strike, a military strike to take out anti-air defenses, he would do so to weaken our air defenses. And if they conducted a cyber attack to knock out our command and control, he's there to weaken our communication systems or our electrical grid. And if you do this, you do it in order to weaken our society, our willingness and capacity to fight, to work together, to come together as a nation. This is part of their broader doctrine on how to confront an adversary. And on the escalation scale, it costs very little money. You can do it with limited attribution. And it works, because the fact of the matter is, with all the things happening in the world today, the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has spent an inordinate amount of time on this important topic. And there are so many other issues we could be focused on. So it's worked to some extent. Is this assessment of it right? This is not interference. This is information warfare designed to sow division and conflict and doubts about, because whether it involves changing voter registration databases in the future at some point potentially, or the stuff we're seeing now, all of that is designed to sow chaos, instability, and basically to get us to fight against each other. We're already fighting against each other in this country. All this does is just sort of stir that up even more. Is that an accurate assessment? Is this informational warfare?
I agree 100%.
So to the extent that it is, and I think everybody's already asked you this question, but wouldn't one of the best things that could happen is that we can focus all day on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. These are ultimately platforms who are being used for informational warfare. I don't believe they invited them in, and there are things they can do to improve their processes, and I wish their disclosures were a little faster. But by and large, they're a platform that's being used. It would be like blaming the road builders because some enemy used that road that they built to put their tanks into your country. So there are things these folks can be doing to improve the way they operate, no doubt about it. But ultimately, we really should be focused on what's being done and not only who they're using to do it. And so my question is, why wouldn't these social media pages be in a position to potentially alert all of their users of not just a public disclosure like they did yesterday in a press conference, but actively send out to all of its users alerts about every time they remove something, so that people can become conditioned to the sort of messages that are being driven by these informational warfare operations?
I believe they can. I believe Senator Blumenthal requested that they do so in response to back in September after the first set of hearings. They did push notifications to people saying that they had seen content, they had liked a page, they had engaged. I believe Twitter sent out emails to users who were affected. That kind of disclosure is absolutely necessary, because one thing that it does is it comes from a platform that is at least seen as somewhat trustworthy, whereas if they hear it from the media, you see these polarized echo chambers where some people don't even believe this is happening.
Senator, I would just add that one of the things we know from looking at both the history of active measures as well as their use across Eastern Europe and Central Europe is that sunlight is one of the most effective antidotes. Transparency, exposure of this activity is critical for both building resiliency and deterring it going forward. And so I absolutely concur that the more information, the more transparency that the platforms can be providing to their consumers, to the users of information about these activities is absolutely critical.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that it's great that Facebook put this stuff out there and that we're having this hearing. I promise you, the vast majority of people that I know back home will never see a single one of these images, because there's a lot going on in the news every day, constantly by the hour.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put what I believe is a context in which we should be thinking about what happened in 2016. First, I think we're all clear that Russia attacked our country during the 2016 election and that they are continuing to attack us today. Russia not only attacked one of our most sacred democratic values, which is a free and fair election, but also, I believe, our very American identity. I often say that we as Americans, no matter our race, religion, or region, have so much more in common than what separates us. And among what we have in common is a love of country and a belief that we as Americans should solely be responsible for the choosing of our elected leaders and the fate of our democracy and who will be the President of the United States. And I think of us then as being a large and diverse family, the American family. And like any family, we have issues and fissures that are legitimate and run deep and provoke potent reactions. We have a history of slavery in this country. We have a history of Jim Crow, of lynchings, of segregation and discrimination. And indeed, we have a lot to do to repair and to recover from the harm of the past and some harm that continues today. But let's be clear. Someone else came into our house, into the house of this country, the family of who we are as Americans. And they manipulated us. And they are an adversary. And they provoked us, and they tried to turn us against each other. The Russian government came into the house of the American family and manipulated us. And we must take this seriously in that context and understand that when we debate, as we did in 2016, one of the most important debates that we have, which is who will be the leader of our country, the Russians exploited our nation's discourse to play into our deepest fear. And as leaders, I believe then it is incumbent on us to speak to the American people about how we can solve this urgent national security threat. I believe first we must act urgently to bolster our country's defenses, like our election infrastructure and cybersecurity, a bipartisan issue that we have been working on in a bipartisan way. I thank Senator Lankford and many of our colleagues throughout the work that we've been doing on the Secure Elections Act. But second, I believe we need to make sure that the American public recognizes who is trying to sow hate and division among us, so that the American public can rightly identify and see it for what it is, an attempt to exploit our vulnerabilities for the purpose of weakening our country and our democracy. And with that, I'd like to ask Ms. DeResta, in your written testimony, you say that the Russian Internet Research Agency, the IRA, efforts targeting the right-leaning, quote, right-leaning and left-leaning Americans was unified in its negativity toward the candidacy of Secretary Clinton. And that, quote, in pages targeting the left, this included content intended to depress voter turnout among black voters. This seems to corroborate the intelligence community's finding that Russia was trying to hurt the campaign of one candidate in the 2016 United States election and help the other. Can you tell us more about what your research has found regarding the nature of the political content that the Russian IRA was pushing toward Americans on social media during the 2016 campaign?
It was unified on both sides in negativity towards Secretary Clinton. It was not unified in being pro-President Trump. So the pages targeting the left were still anti-candidate at the time, Trump. On the right, we did see an evolution in which evidence of support for candidate Trump continued. During the primaries, there was some anti-Senator Rubio, anti-Senator Cruz content that appeared. And there was a substantial amount of anti-Secretary Clinton content on both the right and the left. On the left, that included narratives that either African Americans should not vote, should vote for Jill Stein, which was not a wasted vote. And during the primary, there was support for candidate Sanders.
And then quickly, Ms. Rosenberger, you recently published a report, Policy Blueprint for Countering Authoritarian Interference in Democracies. You described an event on May 21st of 2016 where two groups were protesting in Houston, Texas. And one was called the Heart of Texas, that opposed the purported Islamification of Texas. On the other side, the United Muslims of America, who were rallying to purportedly save Islamic knowledge. And these protests were confrontational. Can you tell me, at the time, were law enforcement or the protesters aware of who had manufactured the conflict?
No, our understanding is that they were not. One thing we do know is that fortunately law enforcement was present at the demonstrations and therefore was able to keep them separate. But one of the things that we believe may have been part of the intent of organizing simultaneous rallies, same day, same place, opposite sides of the street, was probably to attempt to provoke violence.
And then just quickly, if we can follow up in any writing with the committee, but I'd be interested in knowing what your recommendations are for how we can inform law enforcement, because obviously this is a matter that is about public safety and frankly also officer safety. As we know, many of these disruptions end up resulting in violence and harm to many individuals.
Absolutely. I would just point very quickly to the announcement from Facebook yesterday, which actually seems like it may have been something intended to be along similar lines with a protest attempting to gin up very high emotions.
Senator Langford.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. To all of you and your research and the data that you're putting together to be able to help us in this and be able to expose some of the issues. Thank you. Y'all have done a lot of hours at a computer and running a lot of data to be able to get to this point, and we appreciate that very much. Mr. Rosenberg, I want to ask you about some of the recommendations that your team has made, and to follow up on one of the questions that Senator Blunt had started. You've made some very specific recommendations that when we discover attribution, which is not easy to do, but when we discover it, see it as a foreign actor, three main sets of responses you seem to have recommended: sanctions, making sure there's a reputational cost for the country that's doing it, and considering offensive cyber operations. I want to take those in reverse order. What would you consider an offensive cyber operation that would be effective in this means?
Well, Senator, as you know, the use of offensive cyber operations is itself a very complex problem. So I'm
Right.
just going to kind of boil it down to be specific within this context. What I would say is I think that there are instances in which when the U.S. government is able to identify, for instance, the servers that are being used to carry out these operations, based on a variety of potential damage assessments, et cetera, I do think that there are instances in which that might be an appropriate course of action. Again, as we know in offensive cyber, this can often lead to a challenge of whack-a-mole. You set up a new server, et cetera. It does impose a cost. Of course, one of the things that we know that creates challenges is sometimes for these transnational operations, they may, for instance, be using a server in the United States or in the country or in the domain of one of our allies. So that introduces complications. So it's not a super simplistic answer, but I do think that there are instances in which we should consider it.
So you also mentioned reputational costs. I'm not sure there's anyone left on the planet that doesn't understand that Russia does propaganda on their own people and does offensive propaganda against everyone else. What kind of reputational costs could you put on Russia trying to expose their activities?
Senator, the reputational cost recommendation is a little bit more specifically aimed at China, where I think that, as others have alluded to, China has the capabilities and we're seeing them test these things in their neighborhood. China has a longer-term strategic interest that's much more about generating affinity toward it and its model. So I think that reputational costs will be more effective with China. I concur with you that when it comes to Russia, reputational costs are difficult, although I do believe that it is important for the American people to hear clear and consistent messages from our leadership that Russia and Vladimir Putin are an adversary and a threat to our nation.
It was one of the areas that I was pleased with Facebook's announcement yesterday that this committee had talked to Facebook about multiple times. It's one thing to be able to say that they are being used by an adversary. It's another thing to actually show the images.
Yes.
Yesterday, Facebook was rapid to not only say there's an outside entity, we're not saying it's Russia, it looks like it is, but here's the images they're putting out, here are the events they're putting out, and they put out a tremendous amount of data yesterday that's much improved from where we were 2 years ago, where they were still saying we're not sure if they used us or didn't use us. Now they're being very forward-facing on that. That's helpful to be able to get information around faster. Traditional media multiplied that message by putting it out as well. That helps us to be able to get the message out. That's one of the things that we heard on this committee multiple times. European allies have faced from Russia those attacks, that they've been able to get that and have that pushback immediately. So that was helpful to be able to see it yesterday. I have one other question to relate to this as well. You had mentioned a comment here in one of your recommendations on making sure that there's transparency. Passing legislation that ensures Americans know the source of online political ads. Much of what happened with this was not an ad. It was just a profile that was set up that they did a tremendous amount to be able to develop it. How do you separate out being aware where an ad is coming from in just a profile that's a free profile that's developed quite a following?
I completely concur that the political advertising piece of this effort was a small one. My own view, coming from a national security perspective, is when we identify a vulnerability, we should close it off. And so even if it was not the most significant avenue that was utilized, I absolutely believe that applying the same standards to political advertising online that apply offline is absolutely essential. That being said, that will not solve the problem, and we can't be in any way convinced that it will. And so that's why we also recommend a number of transparency measures about providing greater context for users about the origin of information, about whether automation is involved, about requiring some kind of authenticity confirmation while protecting anonymity. I think these are the kinds of steps that can help mitigate some of these broader concerns that you're raising.
I look forward to that conversation. We also need to have a conversation on, is there a level of cooperation needed between the internet service providers, cell phone companies, and others that have a different level of information about where that information is coming from, and then their cooperation with some of the providers of content. Right now, we're leaning on providers of content to say, help us with the data and help police yourself on it. But there's another whole level of information coming from the ISPs and from the cell phone companies and such as well of where that data is actually originating from.
Absolutely. And when you combine that with information that the intelligence community can provide, I think that that is how we begin to put together different pieces of this puzzle to create better identification processes.
Look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your excellent testimony. And we all here appreciate what Facebook did yesterday. I think it was a very appropriate and a timely response. But there was a comment that you made, Dr. Howard, that I think is very important and bears repeating, which is basically the companies are beyond self-regulation. Could you elaborate on that, and then I'll ask the panel if they concur?
I think much of what we've discussed today has come from evidence that has been released very slowly over a 2-year period, often after prodding from you, multiple kinds of committee investigations and multiple governments. When I say that I think the social media industry is past the point of self-regulation, I mean mostly that the more public, open data there is about public life, the faster we can catch these moments of manipulation. For the most part, we've been speaking about American citizens and us as individuals and the impact on our democracy. But democracies have civil society groups, faith-based charities, civic groups, prominent hospitals and universities that are also under attack. And these are also distinct to democracy, and these are the organizations that I think can help defend us.
But I think, again, we have gotten, and the chairman and the vice chairman done a remarkable job. We've gotten, as you say, slowly and surely, we've gotten a little bit more response. But I think the time is running out, frankly, and I think we have to move legislatively to set in motion a framework of disclosure. Someone mentioned, options to remove information, reduce information, or inform the participant. I don't think that will happen voluntarily. It's the president's dilemma. I'm sure they would all love to do it, but unless everyone does it, it's not cost-effective or it's not culturally consistent with their corporation. So let me just go with Ms. Rosenberger and down the line about this comment about, do we have to move very quickly to set up a framework consistent with the First Amendment, obviously, that allows us to deal with this issue?
Senator, one thing I would note is that while the United States has not taken any steps like this, other countries or international institutions have. So the European Union has been moving out, not just with GDPR, but other conversations about regulation of social media and online platforms. China is using its market access as enormous leverage over these companies in order to basically set the terms of the debate. By being absent from this conversation and not taking steps to figure out some of these very thorny issues. But right now, what's happening is other countries, other governments are setting the rules for this space. And that is, in many cases, not in the interest of the United States. I think some of the ideas that Senator Warner put forward in his paper earlier this week are absolutely worth very, very serious conversations and the kind of things we need to be doing.
I think one of the ironies, as you point out, is that we could be disadvantaged because not only don't we get to make the rules, but our companies, our international companies, will follow the rules in China, follow the rules in Europe, and not follow the rules here, leaving us much more vulnerable. No, Dr. Keller.
I believe that it's critical to have access to data from all the platforms in order to detect this kind of activity. And that is a sophisticated analytic capability that needs to be created, and it's going to be a lot of time and effort from a lot of smart people. Where does that data then sit? Who is it that gets to look at it? And I think that our concerns about privacy and the First Amendment lead us to at least suggest we ought to think about industry-oriented consortiums or things that allow a kind of, without moving it too far from industry, let them at least have the first crack at the detection piece.
Well, again, I think your instincts are very consistent with the views of most Americans, but this now has been several years, and we are still waiting for the kind of robust response. Perhaps the Facebook example yesterday is a good sort of sign that the industry is coming around, but again,
yes, Senator. I think that the proactive transparency we saw yesterday from Facebook shows real leadership in the field, and I think we need more of that.
We do, and my concern is that, again, there are other incentives, disincentives, profit, culture, et cetera, that could inhibit that. My time has expired, but ma'am, please.
I think the key is to have oversight. We spoke about finance a little bit earlier, high-frequency trading in particular. There were two sets of regulators. There was self-regulatory bodies that stepped in. There were the exchanges. There's some parallels there where the exchanges are able to see what's happening and immediately before the regulatory process happens, step in and say, not on our platform. I think that that's actually an interesting model, this combination of regulatory, self-regulatory, the exchanges acting independently, and an oversight body looking to make sure the entire ecosystem remains healthy.
The security exchanges.
Correct.
Yes. Doctor, comment?
I'll just say our research certainly shows that the importance of tagging this information so that audience can know the source of it. The appropriate legislative mechanism for that I can't speak to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn.
I can't help but recall the words of H.L. Mencken, who said that for every complex problem, there's a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong. And so I think we need to be a little bit, demonstrate a little humility when we begin to approach this from a public policy perspective, what our response should be. But I also want to ask you about my impression, which is it would be a mistake to think this is just about elections.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah.
And one of the reasons I say that, I came across an article recently entitled "When a Stranger Decides to Destroy Your Life," where somebody used a fabricated story about a woman and posted it online on a website called She's a Homewrecker, and basically ruined this woman's life, or at least challenged it in a dramatic way. And then I thought, well, this is a tool that could also be used by somebody who wants to tank a stock price by disparaging the reputation of a company, and then perhaps sell it short and reap a significant reward. Or if you're a Chinese telecom that wants to get rid of some of the competition, particularly when it comes to developing 5G technology or some other cutting-edge technology, this is also a pretty useful tool using this information warfare. So all of this leads me to wonder if by focusing solely on the election, which is dramatic and of tremendous concern, and I share the concerns of all of you and all the committee, that if we just focus on that and not the rest of the picture, whether we are missing the right picture. Mr. Resta, do you have any observations?
Yes, sir. We look at New Knowledge, we do look at misinformation and disinformation targeting corporates. On the state actor front, we have seen evidence of campaigns targeting agriculture and energy as two industries of interest to foreign powers. On energy, we've seen anti-fracking narratives, anti-fracking bots by countries with strong oil interests. In agriculture, that's taken the form of spreading fear about GMOs.
Yes, Mr. Rosenberg.
I'd also note that in the case of Russia, we know that they use these operations to try to shape our conversations and views on geopolitical issues, especially those of interest to Russia. So, for instance, one IRA-sponsored post on the inauthentic account Blacktivist asked, how would we feel if another country bombed us for the poison water in Flint and for police brutality? That was posted in the immediate aftermath of the Trump administration strikes on Syria after the chemical attack in March of 2017. So clear instance of that account actually criticizing an action by the Trump administration, using emotional issues like the Flint water crisis and police brutality as an avenue in to try to shape views on a geopolitical issue of interest to Russia.
Dr. Kelly?
So I completely agree that there's a commercial dimension of this which is underreported, and there's a lot more going on in the commercial space in terms of these attacks than is reported. Renee discussed some of them. We've seen others with our customers, and sometimes they're tied, these political attacks and the attacks on corporations, where corporations will be basically punished with falsely amplified boycott campaigns and similar measures for doing something which is politically not what Russia would like to see.
Dr. Helmuth, the psychologist Jonathan Haidt gave a speech I saw online recently called The Age of Outrage at the Manhattan Institute, where he basically describes a narrative where there's a lot of things conspiring to manipulate us and invoke outrage for whatever is going on, whether it's cable news, social media, or the like. What can regular Americans do to protect themselves against those, whether they be state actors, whether they be individuals, whether with malicious intent? What can they do to protect themselves? There's one thing for the government to do what we can do from a policy standpoint, but what can average individuals, consumers of social media online, do to protect themselves from being manipulated by fake information or misinformation?
You know, our work in Eastern Europe, and as was mentioned earlier, suggests that people in those areas are very well aware of Russia's intentions. Russia lurks very closely to those nations, and people know what's going on. I think obviously the way to apply that to the United States is understanding the need to know the sources of your information, be able to adjudicate and assess the truthfulness of that information, the potential biases of that information, and then try to make your own decisions on that. Ultimately, it's about being a careful consumer of information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Chair's going to recognize himself for just a question, and then I'm going to recognize the Vice Chairman. We'll see if we've got any members that return after that second vote starts. But it's my intention to try to wrap up as close to noon as we can. You know, I've heard a lot of phrases to describe what went on just in the last few minutes. Disinformation campaign, misinformation campaign, societal chaos campaign. Dr. Howard, I think you used one that struck me earlier, computational propaganda. And my suggestion is that we not come up with a single one, because we're dealing with a generational issue. And I think somebody alluded to it earlier, that it's much easier to take a generation that grew up with these devices and accomplished some type of change than it is for somebody that struggled like me to learn how to use the device and found the most useful TV ad when somebody defriended somebody. They took their picture off the wall. If you remember that Post-it note, that struck home to me. So I think it's important that we speak to as many languages on this, because the task that we've gotten before us is to penetrate the entire population. And it's not limited to the United States, as you have described today. And, you know, I hope that there's a takeaway for the media. This is going on everywhere. It's not limited to politics. It's much more intrusive in the global economic picture today than it is in the political landscape. It's just we like to write about politics. And so I want to point you to this chart I've got over here. It looks like it's something that would be used at the psychiatrist's office to have you just describe what it was. And I'm going to ask you, Dr. Kelly, in our analysis we went through,
and we tried to connect the dots. Who generates it? Where does it go? Does it go to the right? Does it go to the left? And what my staff determined, and I'm looking for your agreement or disagreement, is that in a lot of cases, at least in the 16 cycle, the same person sitting somewhere in the world initiating this propaganda, both initiated the part on the right and the part on the left. That it wasn't two different individuals. Therefore, this was a very well orchestrated, very choreographed plan that they carried out. What's your comment on that?
Well, this is very interesting, and it tells a deeper part of the story that the recent Clemson paper tells, which is that you don't just have one room full of people who are running right-wing trolls and another room full of people running left-wing trolls. It's actually the same people at the same computers. So I think that is a real lesson in how we need to worry about the way they're trying to play us like marionettes, right and left.
And is it safe to say that it's so easy that Russia uses existing views inside of American society? All they do is try to make the gap bigger between the two by inflaming both sides.
I agree. I think that they're not creating these divisions. They're not, and they're doing the same thing in Europe and elsewhere. They find in a society what are the vulnerabilities, what are the groups that oppose each other, and they're basically arming them. It's kind of like arming two sides in a civil war so you can kind of get them to fight themselves before you go and have to worry about them.
So, Ms. Rosenberger, is this any different than really what we faced in the 1960s and the campaigns by the Soviet Union against their adversaries in the world?
It is and it isn't, right? I think the playbook in some way is the same, but the tools that they can use to run those plays are very different. And what we have seen is that digital platforms have supercharged the ability to take that playbook and to really reach a much broader audience more quickly and in a much more targeted kind of way than what we would have seen in the 1960s. There's a difference between hand cranking out leaflets in a basement and passing them around under covert means than there is from putting information online using automated techniques, inauthentic personas to watch it go viral.
I will say that the Vice Chairman has been one of the most outspoken about how technology allows this plan to be on steroids. Words like bots, and he comes up with some new ones every day, that many on the committee and most in the country either didn't understand at the beginning of this or still don't understand. So I'm not sure that we can emphasize enough the intent, but more importantly, the capability. And he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for raising this to the level that it is. I recognize, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's the nicest thing you've said about me, and you said it with no members here.
I can repair the record.
Well, I want to start with what Senator Cornyn and you just said. I think the political piece of this is really going to be relatively small compared to the overall threat. And I think one of the things we've not talked about yet today is the marrying of cyber attacks with misinformation and disinformation. So if somebody goes out and let's say, for example, that the Equifax hack was actually done by a foreign actor and has got personal information on 146 million Americans, then that actor contacts you with your personal financial information, you're going to open that message. And then if behind that message comes a live stream video of what appears to be Mark Zuckerberg or Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the ability to wreak havoc in the markets, it really almost overwhelms what we've seen on the political front. And so this cyber misinformation combination is one that's important. I appreciate when we were talking earlier and recognize, DeResta, you really helped me recently, that even something that seems so obvious as should we have the right to know whether we're being contacted by a human being or a bot has layers of complexity to it. But I think we ought to continue to explore that. Ms. Rosenberger, I've got 2 points I want to make. One is you have rightfully said we want to make sure that we protect anonymity, particularly the foreign journalists in Egypt or the female journalist in Egypt. And the ability to hide sourcing gets easier and easier with the use of virtual private networks. Even with those challenges, shouldn't we have some ability, though, to say, should an American have some ability to put some kind of geocoding location so that if somebody says they're posting a message from Michigan or North Carolina and it's originating in Macedonia or Russia, you ought to at least have that information. Again, we don't have to get to content, but we could just know that there ought to be a second look because the origin of that post may not be what is described in the post. Is that a possible tool?
I think that there are ways that can be, that's one thing that can be investigated. I think there are a variety of ways to require authenticity without requiring disclosure sort of frontally, right? So a platform, in fact, some of them actually do require confirmation of authenticity. Some of them include a verified check that then sort of put another level of sort of authenticity on top of that. But I think that there are ways that authenticity can be confirmed, or at least we can do a lot better to try to confirm it, while still ensuring that we do have anonymity protected. And sorry.
Let me follow up on that, because we've heard today some members talk about Section 230. Mm-hmm. We've heard some members talk about GPDR and the whole privacy bucket. I've raised some issues about humans versus bots. We've talking here about geocoding. One of the areas that we haven't talked so much about, and I appreciate the chairman giving me this extra time, but are there market forces that could help regulate? If we ensured more competition, for example, I was an old telecom guy, and it used to be really hard to move from one telco to another until we implemented requirements of number portability. The Facebooks, the Googles, the Twitters dominate the markets. There may be, as people increasingly have concerns about the safety of their data, the ownership of their data, fake accounts being used, and this doesn't completely work as an analogy, let me state that up front, but the notion of data portability, the notion that would say, if you want to take all of your content off of Facebook, including your cat videos, they have to make it in a user-friendly form to move to NewCo, because NewCo, as part of their business model, is going to have much higher levels of authentication. Is that a possible avenue to look at as well? And I'll take anybody on the panel. Now, I know when you get into data portability, you also got to get into interoperability issues, which makes it, again, not a perfect analogy. But is there a nub of an idea there? Anybody?
I don't have an answer on that exactly, but I think as you're thinking about that, it's important to think that in these kinds of disinformation campaigns, two of the most powerful things are a combination of anonymity and automation. Those two things together allow you to run very large bot armies, so to speak, that are able to affect your objectives. It's important. So those two pieces are something you have to think about, how that concern weaves through this. The other thing to realize, though, about that is that the bots are only part of the army, so to speak. So by solving that problem, even if you force them to identify, you've basically forced a medieval army to, put a flashing light on the archers. There's a lot of other folks out there that are playing more direct roles that you still have to worry about. And I think that those more high-value assets in this kind of cyber-social battle are a little bit harder to find. And they're the ones that, you can't just fire up another 100 of them if you shut the first 100.
I would, and we've done a lot of recognition of Facebook today. I think we should also recognize Twitter, which is in the last 2 months has, even counter to their business model, has taken down lots of fake accounts, lots of fake bots. But is there any possibility here about trying to add more competition into the marketplace as a way to help us sort through this? Not so much just a regulatory approach, but a competitive approach.
I would say one of the challenges is if you fragment the platforms and fragment where people are, then there are more platforms to watch, since this is a systems problem and it does touch everything. That's not to say that that's not a an appropriate course of action, because one of the reasons why this is so effective is there is this mass consolidation of audiences as the internet, which was originally much more decentralized, kind of came to have mass standing audiences on a very small handful of platforms. The challenge there is also, though, that people like that consolidation. They like having a lot of, all of their friends on one platform. So it's kind of a chicken egg problem to think about it in those terms, but happy to continue the conversation.
I would just, if anybody wants to add, my last comment would be, I think one of the earlier statements that were made was that each of these platforms, even as large as they are, really only look after their own content or their own usages. So that ability to see across the whole ecosystem is mostly lacking. And I think the chairman and we've spent a lot of time trying to learn up on this. You feel like the U.S. government is trying to get a handle on this, but has got a lot of work to do as well. So I really want to thank all of you. And one of the things that we might be able to find consensus on, is there more ability for us to urge, force, nudge the platforms in an anonymous way to share more data with independent researchers, because you guys actually can give us that system-wide view that for all the size Facebook has, Facebook can't give us the complete picture.
Senator, I think that's exactly right. I think we need two different kinds of information sharing, and ideally they can somehow be combined. One is greater data sharing between the public sector and the private sector, bringing together the capabilities of the U.S. government, the intelligence community, with the capabilities and what the platforms are able to see happening in their own ecosystem. Of course, that needs to be with privacy and speech protected, but I think there are mechanisms to do that. Number one. Number two is cross-platform information sharing. So I would think about this as both a vertical and a horizontal challenge, and then you have the question of outside researchers, which is absolutely critical. I think that Renee mentioned earlier the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. I think that's one model to look at in this space. There's other models, including from the financial integrity world, as well as from the cybersecurity world, where you have been able to bring together different parts of industry, academics, and the government to ensure that the full picture is put together to best go at this problem.
Well, I just want to, again, thank all of you, but I also particularly want to thank the chairman. His notional idea, he did get this beyond taking the Post-it note off the refrigerator, but he has been a great ally, has moved this committee forward on a whole host of technology issues. This is one where there is no Democratic or Republican answer, since clearly the goal of our adversaries was not to favor one party over the other. It was to wreak havoc and split divisions. And I think this committee under your leadership is trying to take this issue on in the appropriate way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the Vice Chairman. I'm just sitting here thinking a lot of good's happened since we started this drumbeat over a year ago. A lot of changes have happened that I think 12 months ago at some of the companies we would have said never do. A big ship is not turned around overnight. It takes a while. But I think that they have now given us an opportunity to work with them. And I hope that in a month when we have at least 3 of the platforms in, that we will see a willingness to collaborate with us to come up with a solution that fits both legislatively and from a standpoint of their corporate responsibilities. So I'm optimistic that we're started on that pathway to a solution. I remind people that it was this committee that took on legislation for cybersecurity when everybody said it couldn't happen. Is it perfect? No. Was it a good first step? Yes. And part of the challenge, because we're the filter for technology's changes in the world. There's no committee of technology in Congress. There's no agency of technology in Washington. It all sort of dumps in our lap, and we have a perspective that nobody else has. And technology will drive for the next 10 years the way we do things, the way we communicate, where we go, how we do it. Everything in life is going to be driven by technological change. So this is very appropriate that we would be talking about a new architecture. Not necessarily a new architecture for social media, but a new architecture for the relationship between government and the private sector. And I hope that if there's a takeaway from today's hearing. It's that this is the last time we're going to associate the propaganda effort that we see with an election cycle. There's been no interruption since 16. There was no interruption from 14. This was planned out well before we knew who two candidates were. We knew the differences between two parties or where the American people's hot button was. It's flexible enough and nimble enough that it's going to attack whatever the hot button is at a given time that they want to initiate. And I can't thank all of you enough for your candid and insightful testimony. You've given us a lot to think about as we wrestle with how to counteract the problems of foreign influence and its use on social media. I want to summarize what we've heard from today for the American people. The Russians conducted a structured influence campaign using U.S.-based social media platforms and others to target the American people using divisive issues such as race, immigration, and sexual orientation. That campaign is still active today. They didn't do it because they have political leanings to the right or to the left, but because they care about our elections, but rather because a weak America is good for Russia. Some feel that we as society are sitting in a burning room, calmly drinking a cup of coffee, telling ourselves this is fine. That's not fine, and that's not the case. We should no longer be talking about if the Russians attempted to interfere with American society. They've been doing it since the days of the Soviet Union, and they're still doing it today. The pertinent question now is, what are we going to do about it? There won't be an easy answer. The problem requires all of us, government, private sector, civil society, the public, to come together and leverage our distinct strengths and resources to develop a multi-pronged strategy to counteract foreign attacks. We've heard about the problem today and have consolidated and considered some potential recommendations and solutions. The next step is to hear from the leaders of social media companies themselves, and I'm certain that they too learned a fair amount today while watching this hearing and look forward to their responses. They owe it to the American people to communicate clearly and transparently what they view their role to be and what they're doing to combat these foreign influence operations. As I mentioned previously, this issue goes far beyond elections. We're fighting for the integrity of our society, and we need to enlist every person we can. With that, I want to thank you for your time today. I think I've hit within about a minute of what I told you our target would be. This hearing's adjourned.